Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Thank you for joining me on this live stream entitled How Freedom is Set Free by the Face of the Other. Very interesting concept, how freedom is set free by the face of the other. So, getting much inspiration from the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, 20th century Jewish philosopher, especially phenomenologist, tremendous thinker, and I just had to write a book on his thought. I published in 2021 entitled Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with Us. So I want to make commentary on the commentary of this book, especially from chapter 4 entitled Law and Freedom. And thinking along with Levinas, especially his 1964 essay entitled The Temptation of Temptation, a Talmudic lecture. So, welcome to the live stream. Thank you so much for your interest, for your participation. I look forward to the next hour together as you're able. And of course, this video will be published after the live stream is complete, and you can go back to it there. Share it with friends, and spread the good news about the channel. So Levinas defines the freedom which transcends the self in its movement toward the other as a freedom of responsibilities. Again, a very paradoxical concept, a freedom of responsibilities. We want to think together what this looks like, a freedom of responsibilities. So, in other words, Levinas is saying, in order to become free as a human being, it is not a solitary affair. It is not an itinerary that is accomplished by oneself on one's own, but it depends on the verticality of the other. So for Levinas, this relationship between self and other is always fundamental, and there's an asymmetry between this relationship between self and other. The other calls to me, and I have the privilege, the gift, the mission of responding to this call. So we have call and response between the self and the other. And this response Levinas calls, when it's an affirmative one, responsibility for the other. So this movement of the self in a living responsibility for the other means an ecstatic evacuation of the self from itself. There is self-forgetfulness involved. There is a great solicitude the self develops for the other, coming to the aid and the assistance of the other. And it is this, the integrity of this ethical relationship of a lived responsibility, one for the other, that a human being, the self, ascends to enjoy this interpersonal freedom, the freedom that is won through responsibility for the other. Freedom is not, for Levinas, just the decision of the self to become responsible or not. It's not this autonomous, indifferent lifestyle of the self that can do what it wants, when it wants, however it wants. But what is meant by freedom is a faithful and affirmative response to the call of the other who faces me. And I become responsible for her. So there's no way to become free apart from the other. The other is the way to freedom. And the great paradox in all of this is that the other, the needs of the other, the goodness of the other is more important than freedom. That freedom itself is just another signification or description of promoting the good of the other. And this relationship itself is the point. It's not a means to an end, in other words. The relationship between the self and the other is not a means for the self to achieve freedom, but freedom is one for both the other and the self through a faithful affirmative response to the call of the other and the nakedness of the face of the other and the signification of vulnerability, of fragility of the other. That summons me to the very reason for my being. So all of this ethical relationship is defined for Levinas by freedom. But there are things that threaten this relationship. There are things that threaten this relationship. And among these, the first Levinas talks about is the temptation of temptation. So it's worth writing these things out to understand what he means by all this. The temptation of temptation itself is this zone that will cause the self to zone out in relation to the other. The self will drift away from the maturity of responsibility by living in this zone, or we could say dying in this zone of the temptation of temptation. There's a fall from freedom. There's a fall from ethical responsibility to the degree that one is preoccupied by the temptation of temptation. And again, temptation of temptation is not yet temptation per se, but it is the prelude to it. It is this consideration from afar of temptation, and to be tempted by misinterpreting freedom as this freedom as a license to contemplate temptation. And still there is sin, and then still there would be bondage or slavery to sin, which is totally opposed to this interpersonal ethical freedom, one through responsibility for the other. But what distracts from the ethical call is this temptation of temptation. We could say phenomenologically that issues its own call, perhaps a kind of out of curiosity as to what's under this rock and what's under that rock. What is that person doing over there? And they seem to be enjoying themselves. What else have I yet to experience? What else have I yet to learn in terms of knowledge as possession? All of these things are parts of this temptation of temptation that distract the other from the most straightforward fundamental purpose of being a person, being a self, to be responsible for the other. So it's this juxtaposition that we're thinking about with Levinas, and this, we could say, ethical ascent through the proximity of the other, the surplus of sociality, this ethical ascent according to the verticality, and we could say the nobility of becoming responsible for the other, that leads to a situation of true and lasting freedom. Freedom is built by ethical responsibility. Freedom is not in itself just license to be autonomous and enjoy all of these various pleasures and stimulations and entertainments and distractions from the fact of being a self. But yes, according to Levinas, the self wants to escape, wants to evacuate itself, wants to take leave of itself. And we often are tempted to understand that evacuation in terms of pleasure, in terms of a kind of hedonism, every pleasure that that permits the self to forget itself for some moments. But then the self recoils on itself, and instead the self is reinstated in its ilia, in its being there, in its inescapability of itself. But what Levinas says, beyond pleasure, which is a beginning of escape, and there's nothing wrong even with pleasure per se, but the self has to understand through lived experience that pleasure in itself never keeps its promises of a true and lasting liberation for the self from itself. But what will allow the self to take leave of itself once and for all is to enter into the mature vocation of living in responsibility one for the other. And that opens the essence of freedom, this ethical freedom, which is quite different than understanding freedom as license, freedom as arbitration, freedom as autonomous self-determination. But ethical freedom is what Levinas is um, allowing us to recognize in its signification through the call of the other, the nakedness of the face of the other, opening this freedom of responsibilities. This is a mature freedom. This is not a freedom in an arrested development stage. It's not an adolescent kind of egocentric freedom. It's a mature freedom that when coming of age, becoming a son or daughter of the law, this bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, that we arrive at this very ripe, mature understanding of freedom. Because I think it's safe to say we don't tend to think of freedom as defined by responsibility or this freedom itself of responsibilities built up by responsibilities. We see that responsibility often is in opposition to freedom, but Levinas insists freedom is built by responsibility for the other. Freedom, therefore, is revealed as a paradox, for it is not realized by shedding responsibility for the other, but by embracing it. Levinas develops his freedom of responsibilities by reflecting on the Talmudic excerpt of the tractate Shabbat. Within this text, Israel, the people of Israel, is depicted as the people who commit themselves to doing before hearing in the context of the giving of the law, the Torah, on Mount Sinai. So Levinas writes, quote, one accepts the Torah before one knows it. It is a perfectly adult effort, acting before understanding. The excellent choice that makes doing go before hearing does not prevent a fall. It arms not against temptation, but against the temptation of temptation. This undoubtedly indicates that the doing which is at stake here is not simply a praxis or a practical life as opposed to theory, but a way of actualizing without beginning with the possible, of knowing without examining, of placing oneself beyond violence, without this being the privilege of a free choice. A pact with good would exist, preceding the alternative of good and evil, end quote. So this passage marks the striking metaphysical character of Levinas' thought within his overarching method of phenomenology, when he's using language like a way of actualizing without beginning with the possible. It's very much in contrast to a Heideggerian concept of the freedom of Dasein through Ereignis, through the appropriation of being in time. But for Levinas, we could say the time not of the self-revelation of being, but the time of eternity is not manifest, but signified through the charisma, the ethical charisma that is signified through the call of the other. So we have a freedom that is established simply by assenting to the ethical heights of the call of the other who faces me. This originary assent, this originary, we could say, amen in the Hebrew, amen, amen, yes, so be it, let it be done unto me, is where freedom opens. Freedom, Levinas is saying, is not built by knowledge. Freedom is not a matter of let me do some study, let me find out some facts and figures and get back to you, the call of the other. But instead, freedom begins very quickly because freedom itself precedes free choice. Freedom itself, we could say in a sense, is there for the taking in as much as one lets it take you by the ear, by the hand, to become responsible for the other. So freedom is not a question of possibility, where Heidegger writes in Being and Time, higher than actuality stands possibility for this method of phenomenology and his whole project in thinking about the self as Dasein. But for Heidegger, everything is oriented around Dasein, the self. But for Levinas, we have a great ethical inversion of this state of affairs, and everything is oriented instead around the other, which is much more Husserlian than what Heidegger is doing in Being and Time. The primacy of alterity in the work of Levinas, the priority of otherness, and so it goes for freedom itself. Freedom is not discovered in a posteriori fashion, but rather in a priori ethical recognition. And this matches up with Jewish Torah. It says it's a perfectly adult effort. And it resists not only temptation and sin, but even the temptation of temptation. It's not suspicious of the call of freedom that is signified in the call of the other who faces me. The response is not suspicious. It's not duplicitous. It's not slow in responding. It's not divided. But we have the signification and the ethical response of responsibility for the other, uprightness, righteousness, steadfastness, a son or daughter of the law that defines the vocation, the mission of the self. Before hearing the words of the Torah, the Israelites bind themselves to it by virtue of its divine origin. It's the most rational thing to do, in as much as it is a movement toward the infinite. It is not a contemplation of the infinite here. It is in no way mysticism for Levinas. What this is a definite movement, a stepping forward in exteriority. Again, a stepping forward of the self away from itself, in and through the flesh, toward the flesh of the other. Binding oneself by Torah, by virtue of its divine origin, of God who comes to mind in the face of the other through the call of the other. The unwavering trust of the Israelites in divine goodness is the beginning of the law's fulfillment in their daily living. Because they completely trust the lawgiver, they obey the divine command even before hearing it. So, an obedience that paradoxically precedes hearing, an obedience of sacrifice, of act, of risking one's own skin, of, as Levinas says, tearing the bread out of one's own mouth before even contemplating, is this the right thing to do? It's not allowing this buffer between the call and the self. It's not insulating the self in any way. Freedom begins with not even a willful exposure of the self to the other, but merely a recognition of this ethical proximity of the other in relation to the self. So, thank you for your comments as we go along. Yes, freedom built by ethical responsibility. Um, yeah, and thinking about the peculiarity of femininity and masculinity and the relation between the two. Levinas has beautiful reflections about the feminine, especially in his book Totality and Infinity. And maybe I'll talk more about this at another time. But there is a kind of a feminine genius in this, and this is why I'll get in future live streams to another chapter in this book entitled Maternity, and how this ethical relationship comes to the fore, especially in a feminine figure and form and signification. Thinking about maternity, um, there's so much rich content there for phenomenological investigation. So we'll definitely get into this in the future. But for now, we continue to think about the divine origin of Torah and the entirely rational move to bind oneself to this Torah by virtue of its proceeding from the mouth of the infinite, which again is revealed in the particularity of the call of the other facing me. In other words, the Israelites, as we read in the Hebrew scriptures, do not insist first on hearing the prescriptions of the law of God and then considering for themselves whether or not they are amenable to them. The beginning of covenant relationship with God is a yes. And the same is true for something like a marriage relationship, in which a man binds himself to a woman till death do they part. A woman binds herself to a man till death do they part. The power of this relationship is in the oath. We call it the consent, the vows, the oath that is at the beginning. And it is the oath itself that opens the freedom of the relationship. This is what postmodern hierarchy of values does not understand about relationships. Without the oath, there is no freedom to love, like in a marriage relationship. That freedom is gained through the oath, through the irrevocable commitment, through entering into this covenant relationship that is defined by freedom, totality, exclusivity, fidelity, and fecundity. No oath, no fecundity to the highest degree. And so, marriage itself, as the most concrete covenant relationship that we experience, that we observe as human beings, and from a Catholic perspective, for sure, is meant to signify what Levinas is talking about here in terms of covenantal freedom, ethical freedom, that a man and woman don't take stock of all of their needs and in a kind of speculation, will this other person meet all my needs through the course of decades to come. But instead, it's a risk. It's this wager. It's hazarding oneself in relation to the call of the other with the confidence in the fidelity of the power of responsibility, one for the other. And so one dares to marry, one dares to make the oath publicly before God and before the congregation, before the assembly, to the degree that one is confident in the power of responsibility and the signification of fidelity of ethical relationship. And in through this responsibility keeps its promises in such a way that no pleasure does, no inventory of needs and their temporary fulfillment does. Covenant is a call to the totality of infinity. So thank you for the comments, Nadan Halila. The concept of ethical responsibility reminds you of a beautiful phrase from Elizabeth Lesueur. Every soul that rises itself elevates the world. Yeah, that is very beautiful. And that's the concept here. What we have in mind is the common good of the world. The common good of the world. And yes, there's a Jewish intuition here, as someone mentions. Abe mentions Edith Stein in the chat, and we're thinking of Emmanuel Levinas, Edith Stein. This Jewish intuition of ethical monotheism, the heights of exteriority, the heights of this ethical monotheism, the signification of the infinity and transcendence of divinity in and through the lived ethical relationship. So all of this together we have in this synthesis. So we do well to study these tremendous thinkers and practitioners of the ethical. After all, the essence of original sin that we read about in the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Scriptures, chapter 3, the essence of original sin began with this zone of the temptation of temptation, where there's yet no culpability, but there's this consideration of what would it be like to be like God? This beginning of a very illusory attempt to rob divinity of its proper divinity. For the creature to try to rob God of God's divinity, the essence of original sin begins with this, we could say, a contemplation of all of a sudden putting the ethical relationship at arm's reach and thinking about it and thinking, do I want to be ethical or not? Do I trust God or not? This otherwise than trust, then responsibility, then ethics. This otherwise that metaphysically signifies a drift toward nothingness, a drift away from this actualizing without beginning with the possible that we call covenant relationship, a drift away from this toward prime matter, which is in itself metaphysically non-existent, to drift back into nothingness, for the creature to drift back into nothingness with this consideration of some possibility other than the actuality of divinity, of divine law, of responsibility, and it's an illusion because it's not even a real possibility. It's a fake one. To confuse an actual possibility for a subtraction of possibility in the name of possibility is the essence of original sin. So we have to be very careful in philosophy and when we're doing phenomenology, not to confuse authentic possibility for its cancellation, also we're calling possibility, but in fact is inauthentic because it's possibility lacking. Where actuality goes lacking, so does possibility. And actuality comes first. This is what Levinas is bringing us to in a phenomenology of freedom that leads back to the metaphysical foundation of freedom. The non possibility of a non freedom, which is a beyond freedom, in everything we think in the concept of freedom. By overcoming the temptation of evil, by avoiding the temptation of temptation. Wow. Whew. This is serious philosophy. This is serious philosophy. Getting us to the essence of freedom in a way that we didn't see coming. Because so often we understand, we interpret freedom as this plethora of possibilities, plethora of choices, and the more choices I have, the more free I am to choose this or that, and no one is getting in my way. And so one might think, if I have millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars, I would be the most free person in the world because I have all this potency, I have all this money, I have all this cash flow, and so I can spend it how I want. But have you ever had the experience where you're before a menu at a restaurant and there's so many options, you don't know what to choose? You're paralyzed by possibility. And this is what happens not only by the Medusa of possibility understood in relation to freedom as license, but also to understand possibility in terms of my unlimited choices and to place the essence of freedom on the will itself, on choice itself. But again, we might ask, does every choice lead to greater freedom, open freedom further? And a quick survey of lived experience says, no, some choices start to limit freedom itself. What I thought was unlimited choice becomes a paralysis of possibility, a paralysis of potentiality with no action, no ethical action. And so if I sit here with all of my bucks, all of my dollars, all of my money, and I don't go the distance with this ethical progress toward the other, and I don't interpret my money as a means of diaconia, of serving the other in responsibility in love, then I will insulate myself to the point of death. It will be a premature death that already begins with the closure of ethical responsibility. So we see very clearly the method of phenomenology is helping us to delineate between authentic possibility and inauthentic possibility, an actual opening of possibility or a closure of possibility. And we don't want to confuse the term possibility in such a way that we're delimiting possibility even through its name, even through its term, possibility. In the name of possibility, I'm delimiting possibility. This is a great paradox we have as human beings. This is what Levinas is getting at. The essence of original sin is this kind of thing. A decision for nothingness over and against being from a metaphysical standpoint. From a Levinasian standpoint, a decision for the autonomous self over and against the heteronomy of divinity. But Levinas is bringing us back philosophically to a fundamental trust in the heteronymous ethical law proceeding from the mouth of the infinite, in the particularity of the mouth of the other person who faces me, and the nakedness of his or her face. So instead of pretending to pass judgment on the divine judge, we read in the Hebrew scriptures that Israelites willfully submit to divine legislation before its articulation. This amounts to an inversion of original sin and a refusal of the temptation of temptation. Disobedience begins with the temptation of temptation. It is, we could say, the first step. The temptation of the temptation is the first step toward disobedience, toward actual sin. It begins with the audacity of the finite to pass judgment on the infinite. It begins with the demand to measure and scrutinize the law of God according to arbitrary standards of human calibration. Disobedience stems from a pretentious subjectivity that considers itself as ultimate autonomous authority. Obedience to Torah, in contrast, expresses the structure of a subjectivity clinging to the absolute. This is something quite different than an autonomous, finite, self-legislating being. But a structure of subjectivity that itself clings to the absolute. Obedience, the Shema of Judaism, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. There's a oneness, a simplicity, an integrity of the revelation, the signification of divinity in and through the ethical one for the other relationship of responsibility. Obedience recognizes the anteriority of Torah before logic, the anteriority of freedom before free will, the anteriority of God before humanity. And further in this essay, Levinas writes, quote, that the mind needs training suggests the very mystery of violence's interiority to freedom, suggests the possibility of an adherence prior to free examination and prior to temptation. So there's a violence in insisting, for the self to insist that I need to sort all this out in order to make an informed decision. But what Levinas is getting at is the proximity of the other, the magnitude of the call of the other persuades with immediacy. There's no need to try to put it at arm's reach, take a step back and wonder. If one goes into some kind of pursuit of ecstasy through mysticism apart from the ethical relationship with the other, that's ethics starts to fade. Rationality starts to fade. And Levinas is saying we ought not to do this. Further, he writes, quote, the teaching which the Torah is cannot come to the human being as a result of a choice. That which must be received in order to make freedom of choice possible cannot have been chosen unless after the fact. Wouldn't divine revelation be precisely a reminder of this consent prior to freedom and non-freedom? Wow. What he's doing philosophically is putting thought in touch with the infinite, more than a concept, more than a process of cognition, more than the relationship we say in phenomenology between the noesis and the noema. This is not even an oasis of the infinite, but rather it's the oasis of the infinite that is giving rise through ethical signification to this, the noematic processes of conscious thought. This oasis of the infinite that is prior to the distinction between freedom and non-freedom, prior to the distinction between yes or no. The infinite is signified as a trace through the ethical relationship between the self and the other in such a way that there is a signification prior to every manifestation. There is an ethical signification prior to every given phenomenon. This is why Levinas calls this ethical relationship a non-phenomenon. It's not a question of manifestation. It's not a question of givenness. This ethical relationship, that is the immediacy of anthropology. It is our immediate, common anthropological situation, universally speaking, through phenomenological analysis, thinking about the situation of the self, of the lived experience of the self. What is first? Le premier venu, the first comer, is the other. Before I have any time to think, before I have any time to decide yes or no, there is the yes of the vocation that assigns me to meaning, that gives rise to meaning, the ethical signification, the bareness, the immediacy of the ethical signification gives rise to the mediation, its mediation through language, through interpretation, through hermeneutics, through philosophy. This is the relationship in Levinas' work between the saying, which coordinates with the infinite and the absolute, the saying and the said. We say all these things way after the fact of the perpetuity of the saying, the infinity of the saying, the absoluteness of the saying. So to receive the gift of Torah, a law, is to fulfill it before consciously accepting it, without being less pure than the freedom that would arise from freedom, in the non-engagement of the one who is tempted and who tries his luck. The freedom taught by the Jewish text starts in a non-freedom, which, far from being slavery or childhood, is a beyond freedom. A freedom that needs to be set free because we've misinterpreted it for so long. Jewish Torah grants us this return to the call of the other, the face of the other. The face of the other that appears to the degree that it speaks, brings us back face to face with this way of actualizing without beginning with the possible, brings us face to face with a personalized freedom that is signified much earlier than the time to choose. Dasein, and the temporality of design is not an absolute after all, but depends on the alterity of the absolute, toward which it must give an account. In his book, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, Levinas writes, quote, "The freedom of another could never begin in my freedom. That is, abide in the same presence, be contemporary, be representable to me. The freedom of the other is not contemporaneous with the freedom of the self. The responsibility for the other cannot have begun in my commitment, my decision, my free choice. But the unlimited responsibility in which I find myself comes from the hither side of my freedom, from a prior to every memory, an ulterior to every accomplishment, from the non presence par excellence, the unmanifest, the non original, the anarchical, prior to or beyond every essence. So, when I speak of the essence of freedom, I'm betraying the saying by the said. Levinas is talking about the state of affairs he's calling freedom, one through ethical responsibility for the other, that is prior to every essence, because beyond every essence, beyond every um, manifestation or givenness of every phenomenon. So this is wow. I'm just very stunned by this philosophy, even coming back to it after years of writing this essay originally, and again taking commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with Us. So I'll present for about 10 more minutes. If there's any questions, comments, you can keep putting them in the chat. And but I'll keep presenting on this topic of law and freedom in the work of Levinas, overcoming the temptation of temptation. So Levinas speaks of this obedience to Torah. Torah, a Hebrew word that means law, teaching, instruction, way. This obedience to Torah, the Shema, another Hebrew word, Shema, to hear, to obey, to listen to this word of God, this teaching from divinity. Obedience to Torah, therefore, is an uprightness that, as an original fidelity to an indissoluble alliance or covenant, a belonging with consists in confirming this alliance and not in engaging oneself headfirst for the sake of engaging itself, not being like a Ulysses, not being like a Don Juan, not just doing things for the heck of it, not just experiencing something just to experience something. Experience is cheap. Thrills are a dime a dozen. But responsibility is what costs everything. This love that loves at a cost, at a sacrifice, Levinas talks about. So we can adopt a lifestyle according to the pandering pleasures of lived experience if we want. Yes, we can make the choice, and it begins with the choice, and it comes back to the choice as ultimate, that has nothing to stand upon except hovering above nothingness in this pretentious autonomy of the self-legislating finite being barely existing, and making this choice an ultimate, and making this will an ultimate. But instead, what Levinas is saying, what he's talking about here, is an alliance that grants this transcendence of the futility of decision, the futility of deciding in favor of one more pleasure and one more stimulation and one more distraction. But an alliance, an indissoluble alliance, an original fidelity, this uprightness that consists in remaining steadfast within the covenant between self and other, and not living life according to wanting just to experience another experience, not looking for more eye candy, more beautiful views, more tasty dishes, more exciting thrills. All of these kinds of things are so egocentric, so ephemeral, effervescent as they might seem, ecstatic as they might seem, but every ecstasy of this sort betrays what it began. So again, for Levinas, we're moving away from the betrayal that moves through the temptation to sin, to slavery, to certain vicious patterns of being, all in the name of the conatus estendi, the struggle to be. What a paradox, to drift toward nothingness in the name of being. This is why he writes books like Otherwise Than Essence or Beyond Being, to move beyond being, beyond the name of being, beyond the exigencies of being, is to move into the exigencies of the ethical that transcends self-preservation in one's own being, that exceeds reinstatement in one's own miserable ilia, one's own suffocating being in oneself. To make a final and lasting exodus of the self outside of the self demands the other, the call of the other depends on the other. And that one realizes within the fidelity of this relationship, a living one for the other and steadfast responsibility for the other. This is what we mean ultimately by freedom and the fullness of the concept after the ethical fact. So it's quite different, this concept of freedom in Levinas, from a typical fast food mentality, your way, right away, freedom as license, freedom as self-determination, freedom as nobody telling me what to do. What a paradox. If that's what I think freedom is, no obligation, no responsibility, no need to listen to any call of any other. Levinas says that is precisely slavery to the self, and it proceeds toward nothingness. If it's a very frustrated existence, it's an interpretation of selfhood inevitably as the Ilia, and all of the money in the world can't set me free from that. It can't. I can pretend to be set free with all my money and all my spending and all my pleasures, but do I not recoil back into my selfish, self-concerned, self-absorbed self? And that's not fun. That's not very interesting. It's not very adventuresome. The self that risks nothing but wants to gain everything. But the paradox we have in this Levinasian understanding of freedom is that one gains everything precisely by risking everything. One has much skin in this game of ethical responsibility for the other. So this is Levinas. I'd say Levinas, and the philosophy of Levinas at its finest. The alliance is between Torah and the human subject. A covenant relationship obtains between God and humanity, between Hashem and humanity, through the mediation and signification of Torah and its ethical imperatives. Fidelity to Torah takes precedence over self-discovery because Torah contains what Levinas calls a lucidity without tentativeness, a history whose conclusion precedes its development, a practice prior to voluntary adherence, an ethical order prior to the world. Levinas writes, quote, "It may be, however, that the notion of action, instead of indicating praxis, as opposed to contemplation, a move in the dark, leads us to an order in which the opposition of engagement and disengagement is no longer decisive, and which precedes and even conditions these notions of engagement or disengagement, but a praxis prior to praxis." So it's neither contemplation or a praxis, neither theoria or a praxis, because it is a way of being in the world before having a chance to figure it out. It is tradition, it is handed on, it is a life breathed one into the other. It is a kiss on the lips of Hashem. The meaning of being, the meaning of creation, Levinas says, is to realize the Torah. The world is here so that the ethical order has the possibility of being fulfilled, because its pattern defines its very order. So just a few more points. And again, if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat. Thank you so much for joining me in the live stream. If you're not already a subscriber, I invite you to subscribe and stay up to date on the most recent live streams, which is the main contents flowing in this channel, Monday through Friday. Many other good videos already published, many other series, presentations, podcasts to check out. But this, I really enjoy, again, taking commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with Us. Emmanuel Levinas, 20th century Jewish, Lithuanian, French phenomenologist and philosopher. So just a few more points thinking about the work of Levinas, and we'll wrap up today's live stream. Does any knowledge rival that proclaimed in the Torah? What could compare to the unrelenting ethical summons to responsibility in the face of my neighbor? What other knowledge contains its future history in its past declaration? What other knowledge prescribes a way to live anchored in the infinite because it proceeds from a past more ancient than any present? This is a phrase of Levinas, a past more ancient than any present. And so, unlike Levinas' admonition to consider Torah as primal and ultimate knowledge, we often regard knowledge as neutral, prior to and apart from lived ethical experience. But what Levinas writes in this same essay, this Talmudic reading entitled The Temptation of Temptation, is, quote, to join evil to good, to venture into the ambiguous corners of being without sinking into evil, and to remain beyond good and evil in order to accomplish this, is to know. What we mean by knowing. One must experience everything through one's own self, but experience it without having experienced it yet, especially through the internet, before engaging oneself in the world. For experiencing itself is already committing oneself, choosing, living, limiting oneself. But to know a thing, to know about a possible experience, without experiencing it, without living it, this is the temptation of knowledge itself. We want to know before we do. But we want only a knowledge completely tested through our own evidence. Oh my goodness, isn't this the case? With so many things in life, even when it comes to the question of God, we want a knowledge of God that is completely tested through our own predetermined evidence. This is the essence of the caducity of atheism as a final point of view. Atheism is always an important moment in philosophy, that we don't worship conceptual idols, that we don't reduce divinity to even the concept of divinity. But atheism, qua atheism, is always precisely this so-called knowledge of God or God's non-existence, tested thoroughly by our own evidence. Atheism qua atheism is an adjudication of infinity according to the standards of finitude. That's the problem. That's why it's false. Atheism is entirely false as a worldview, uh, because for anyone to say God doesn't exist, it's always in reference to finite standards of judgment. And so, yes, the finite God does not exist. On this we all can agree. But nobody, no finite being can pronounce judgment on the infinite. It is entirely the other way around. And this is where the philosophy of Levinas is escorting us. Ah, I have 3 minutes to explain the title. Okay, well, I'll try to sum it up. The title, if I can remember it, How Freedom is Set Free by the Call of the Other, or the Face of the Other. You'll have to watch the video. It will be published in just a few minutes. How about that? You will find out by watching this video, which will be published this past hour. I've been presenting how someone else determines the personal freedom of a self. And then you can respond in the comments if you'd like. But just to wrap up this quote from Levinas, from his book, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, this contrast between knowledge and ethical freedom. We do not want to undertake, Levinas says, anything without knowing everything, and nothing can become known to us unless we have gone and seen for ourselves, regardless of the misadventures of the exploration. We want to live dangerously, like Ulysses, but in security, in the world of truths. So, end quote. So, Levinas is saying we tend to interpret freedom according to the inclusion of the temptation of temptation within the pursuit of freedom. We want to experience everything, and this itself is the essence of our so-called freedom. We want to taste everything. We want to know everything. And we think the more omniscient we become, the more free we become. But rather, what Levinas is saying is there is this, we could say, the maturity of naivete, the maturity of a kind of uh, ethical immediacy that does not need to experience everything to know it, that does not need to know before deciding, but it's the immediacy of a decision that goes before every other uh, conditional decision, every other decision conditioned on this ethical relationship, one for the other, this responsibility, this ethical state of affairs that conditions every phenomenological given. So the alliance between Torah and the human subject is the very alliance between the self and the other. This alliance is attested to goodness itself. It's attestation to goodness itself. The true meaning and real value of goodness, understood as the unconditional of the other, despite its otherness, consists precisely in overcoming the evil threatening the other with reduction and destruction. Instead, establishing another relation with him or her, one resting on attention and devotion to the other. That's a quote from Roger Burgrave's essay, Violence and the Vulnerable Face of the Other. Torah is materialized within the fabric of human relationships, where it takes on flesh through uprightness and responsibility. No additional knowledge informs Torah or adds to its primordial message. So, these are some points I want to share about Levinas, about his ethical phenomenology, ethics as first philosophy, understanding freedom according to this ethics as first philosophy. These comments at the end here, what if one can just do and experience whatever it is they like without the idea of ethic or even morality involved? Levinas is saying that's the problem. That leads us to a non-freedom. So again, if we think about these opposing points of view, Levinas says freedom is not exploring the universe, which will always include the circles of hell. Freedom involves a movement away even from the temptation of temptation. Freedom involves a movement away from interpreting the self as autonomous, as self-legislating, as knowing better than God, as knowing better than the infinite, as knowing better than this ethical summons through the law of God in Judaism called Torah. So it's a trust in divine goodness that is signified in and through Torah, itself a residue of the already there ethical relationship that precedes our own human legislation of the prior, we could say, script of the legislation of the infinite. Um, so, uh, yes, yes, having boundaries and not even needing to know uh, this distinction between good and evil, because one forms a covenant with the good. So, in the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Scriptures, chapter 3, the essence of original sin is the act of considering uh, this distinction between good and evil, and as if the essence of freedom is to be able to choose between it or to go back and forth. Sometimes I choose what is good, sometimes I choose what is evil. But what is evil if not a lack of goodness? So to choose evil is to choose nothingness, is to choose a lack, is to choose a subtraction, and it is, in essence, to cheat one's choice, to reduce one's choice, to delimit choice itself. Uh, so this is the concept. Um, so thank you for the comments in the chat. Trying to catch up with these. Uh, uh, there is nature, there is reason, but there's also the otherwise than everything we call the infinite, we call divinity. And it is this relationship between the finite and the infinite that Levinas says comes about through the relationship between the self and the other. So, relationship between the self and the other is a movement toward what we could call the infinite. The infinite is showing up here. So, responsibility for the other builds freedom, builds this authentic freedom of the common good, not just me, myself, and I, who don't form a fellowship after all. We don't have friendship between the self and the self, but friendship, fellowship, community um, depends on exteriority and the proximity of exteriority in the face of the other, the call of the other. And so there's this ethical relationship that expands freedom precisely through responsibility. And we call the edifice, as it grows, the common good. So thank you all so much. If you are just joining the live chat toward the end, I invite you to watch the whole video as it'll be published in just a couple of minutes on YouTube, as well as many other videos, other live streams I've done, other presentations on phenomenology, on metaphysics, the work of Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Luc Marion, Paul Ricoeur, so many other topics in Judaism and Christianity and Catholicism. on this channel. So thank you for your interest, for your participation. May we all continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.